Welcome, welcome, greetings all. I am, of course, Dr. Gentleman, and today we're talking about, BAM! Les Misérables! Let's start episode 3 of Great Works! Yes, this is Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Oui, mon français est très pauvre, je sais. My French is very bad, I know. That's why from now I'm going to refer to the author not as Victor Hugo, which I find a little bit awkward to say, but in anglicized form as Victor Hugo. Before we talk about this lengthy and flawed masterpiece, let's see if any questions came in. Oh, 2 questions. We're going places. First question. Cut your hair. Not a question. But I will, probably around Christmas time. Okay, second question. Well, strictly speaking, first question.
If you have a PhD in English, recite a Shakespeare sonnet right now!
Okay, first, I don't know what it is that you think we do to get an English PhD, you know. We don't sit around in a circle and recite poems to each other. And second, okay. Sonnet 20. A woman's face with nature's own hand painted her style, the master mystery of my passion, a woman's gentle heart, but not acquainted with the shifting changes, is false woman's fashion, and I more bright than theirs, less false and rolling, gilding the object whereupon it gazeth, the man in hue or hues in his controlling, which steals men's eyes and women's souls amazeth. And for woman wert thou first created, till nature as she wrought thee, fell a doting, and by addition me of thee defeated, by adding one thing to my purpose nothing, but since she pricked thee out for women's pleasure, mine be thy love, and thy love's use, their treasure. That one has some naughty jokes in it. Tee-hee-hee. Don't tell YouTube. Okay, back to Les Misérables. This is actually my favourite novel. And here's me saying so when I was younger and better looking. In terms of my all-time favourite book, I would probably go for Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. I really think this is a good book to read when you're a kid, even though obviously it's famously long. I still had some hope for the world back then. It's an incredible work, but yes, it is a long... Wow, now that's an old meme. It's actually super easy for me to tell when my students are just pretending to have read this book, when actually they've only seen the musical. Did you read it?
Oh, sure I did, every word.
Then what happens at the very start of the book?
Oh, well, there's this guy, Jean Valjean, and he's in prison for stealing a...
No! Les Misérables starts with a very long, boring account of the daily life of the Bishop of D. 5 chapters of it! If you read it, you would remember! No, but for real, if you do decide to read this book, please don't give up because of this opening. It is worth it, I promise you. After that, the story is probably as you know it. Jean Valjean is a petty thief who was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but stayed in there for 19 because he kept trying to escape. Not the smartest baguette in the boulangerie. When he's finally released, nobody wants anything to do with an ex-con, so hating the world, he steals the bishop's silverware. When he's caught, the bishop lies and says he gave the silver to Valjean. He even adds some silver candlesticks to the stash. The generosity completely turns Valjean's life around, especially when the next day he reflexively steals a coin from a little kid and realizes that maybe he's not the nicest guy. So he starts again, becoming an upstanding member of society and a respected industrialist, even rising up to become the mayor of his town. A policeman from the prison called Javert just happens to be there to see Valjean use his incredible physical strength to save an old man called Fauchelevent. Fauchelevent isn't that important, although he does come back later. I just like saying his name. Fauchelevent. While Javert isn't sure, this makes him think he's found Valjean. Why does that matter? He did his time, right? He was released. Well, there's actually a warrant out for his arrest, because he stole that coin. The kid must have reported it, and somehow they pinned it on Valjean. Anyway, the disguised Valjean and Javert have a squabble about a girl called Fantine. Fantine really has a miserable life. Les Misérables, the miserable ones. Desperate to keep sending money to a couple of con artists who are looking after her daughter, but keep demanding money for medicine, Fantine has got a job at Valjean's factory, but she got fired. Why? Because she had a kid out of wedlock. Jeez Louise! The reason Valjean and Javert are fighting is that she attacked somebody who had shoved snow down her dress, and Javert arrested her.
Victim blaming.
Valjean insists it was the man's fault and takes her to hospital to be treated for probably tuberculosis.
and that's where she tells him about her kid. But now Javert is annoyed.
I'll teach that big nasty factory man, Monsieur Madeleine. I'm sure that he is that nasty criminal who has been on the run for many years for stealing a coin from a little boy.
But when trying to report Valjean, Javert discovers that they've already caught the perp. Valjean is in custody. So he tells Valjean about this, and of course the trial just happens to be the very next day. So, you know, poor JVJ can't let some poor chump take the fall in his place, so he goes to the courtroom and he reveals his true form.
2, 4, 6, so...
Hugh Jackman, you didn't go high enough! Clearly you should have done it like me. Clearly. So nobody stops Valjean, so he goes back to the hospital to see Fantine. But Javert follows him and comes to arrest him. Fantine, who was told by the doctors that her daughter Cosette was actually there in the hospital, realizes that this was a lie, and that her beloved mayor and saviour is actually a wanted criminal, and in her weakened state, the shock of it all makes her pass away. Honestly, this is as melodramatic as Hugo gets, and in my opinion it would have been better to have her pass away with dignity rather than this sort of gasp dead moment. But just like with Nancy's death in Oliver Twist, and with a lot of other parallels to that other fallen woman who is better than all of the people around her and just a victim of a system that's set up to stop her being able to look after herself, this is a sad end for a sad character. Javert arrests Valjean and locks him up, but at this point Valjean is like a level 99 escape artist, so he soon gets out of prison with the help of a little coin that has a file hidden inside.
Jean Valjean, secret agent.
They catch him again, but this time he escapes from prison by faking his own death and goes to find Fantine's daughter Cosette. You know the one. The little sad-faced girl doing the sweeping. She's being kept by the Thénardiers, a somewhat comic but mostly really reprehensible couple who have been abusing little Cosette and basically making her into their mini-servant. When Valjean arrives and tells them that no more money is going to come for the girl, they're pretty happy to get rid of her to this random man. Well, after they get him to give them a few francs. 1,500 francs. That's a lot of money back in 1823. Good thing Jean Valjean had the foresight to bury most of his fortune before he went to the trial. Now I'm imagining some alternate universe version where some pirates get his treasure map and dig up his treasure. Sadly, no pirates here. Jean Valjean takes Cosette to Paris, where they live happily for a little while, at least until Javert comes sniffing around. That hairy French bloodhound. Luckily, their old friend with the awesome name, Fauchelevent, sneaks them into the convent where he has been working, and they live there happily for about 8 years. But then the streets of Paris erupt into a violent battle.
Ooh, I've seen the musical. I know this one. That's the French Revolution, right?
No! This is the June Rebellion, and I'm not going to get into French history in detail, but basically there was the big French Revolution at the end of the 1700s, which led to Napoleon being in power. And then they got rid of him in 1814 and brought the Bourbon monarchs back, well, random 100 days aside. In 1830 they had another revolution, they really like revolutions, and they got rid of the Bourbon monarchs, but they just had another king instead who was the old king's cousin. In simple terms, this rebellion was formed from people who didn't want any king at all. Yes, it's complicated. Anyway, Cosette's now all grown up, and she has caught the eye of a young rebel student named Marius. Marius's dad has somehow got the idea that Thénardier, the innkeeper, is a great hero who saved his life at the Battle of Waterloo, when actually he was just trying to rob his body. It's a fun little scene that Hugo buries in 19 chapters describing the battle. This is worse than the priest part! Again, dear reader, I just have to say, please plow on through. I mean, you know by now that it's worth it, right? Anyway, the Thénardiers moved to Paris when their inn went bust, showing that Hugo loves coincidence just as much as Dickens. Not only did they move to the same house that Jean Valjean was in when he first moved to Paris, Marius lives next door and has actually friend-zoned their oldest daughter, Éponine. Meanwhile, Éponine's little brother Gavroche is a streetwise little gamin who's getting mixed up with the rebels. What's that? You didn't know that Gavroche is a Thénardier? Yeah, they cut it out of the musical. Actually, if any character has been changed beyond recognition for the musical, it's Gavroche. As a matter of fact, the whole idea of making a musical of Les Misérables came to Alain Boublil, sorry if I'm mangling your name, when he was watching the musical of Oliver and realised that Dodger had a lot in common with Gavroche. So he basically changed Gavroche into another Dodger. It works, and I love the musical, but it's a little bit of a shame that more people don't know Hugo's Gavroche, who is a lot less sassy and a bit more thoughtful. Then he has a whole plot arc which I absolutely adore, where he looks after two little boys he finds wandering the streets. His parents, the Thénardiers, never showed him any love, so he tries to make their lives a little bit better, looking after them and teaching them how to look after themselves from his hideout in the Elephant of the Bastille. He does all this without ever realising that those two are actually his real little brothers. It's a great side story that really makes you care for Gavroche, much more than, you know, him warbling about how you should never kick a dog because it's just a pup. It's through the Thénardiers that Marius gets close to Cosette and her surrogate father, Jean Valjean. The Thénardiers actually recognised Valjean when he came for a philanthropic visit, and they try to extort him, but Marius from next door overhears and goes to get Javert. He comes and busts in and he arrests everyone, including poor old Éponine. Gavroche's only interaction with his parents in this whole novel is to help bust them out of prison, which, given how much it happens in the story, seems like a pretty easy thing to do. Éponine gets out too, and she helps Marius to finally meet Cosette. Poor friend-zoned Éponine. At this point, the rebellion kicks off, led by student agitators like Enjolras, Gregory. Musical fans will remember this character for waving the big flag and getting some of the most catchy songs. Do you hear the people sing? A lot of them die in the fighting, including Enjolras and Éponine, who literally takes a bullet for Marius. Even little Gavroche is shot after he goes out to collect unused cartridges from the guardsmen that the rebels have killed. This is sometimes used to tie Gavroche to the boy in Delacroix's beautiful painting, La liberté guidons le peuple. Because he's got an ammunition box over his shoulder. And while that may be true, Hugo being well known for taking inspiration from many different places, it would be a little bit ironic, because that would mean that Gavroche died in a battle that was essentially a reaction against what this boy was figuratively fighting for. Valjean, who knows about the romance between Marius and Cosette, but is a bit suspicious after the encounter with the Thénardiers, decides to go and check on Marius, and goes to the barricade dressed in the uniform of a guardsman, the uniform of the enemy. Luckily though, Marius recognises him, and he is welcomed as an ally. There he sees Javert, who is tied up. He was trying to spy on the young students, but he was rumbled when Gavroche recognised him. Valjean takes Javert out to the back, telling the others he's going to execute him, but he just shoots in the air and lets him go free. In truth, a bunch of students with guns deciding to go up against the Parisian military was never going to end in glory. They are massacred, and Valjean escapes down to the sewers with a half-dead Marius, and there he meets Thénardier, who is looting the bodies there like some unscrupulous RPG character. Javert catches Valjean on his way out, but he allows him time to take Marius back to his family. When Valjean returns to Javert to turn himself in, he finds that Javert has gone. Abandoning his rigid devotion to duty has given Javert this existential crisis that he just cannot handle. So, in the end, he just throws himself into the Seine to drown. It's more or less happily ever after from there, so not all that miserable. Valjean pays for a lavish wedding for Cosette and Marius, who doesn't know who saved him that day. But Valjean also confesses to Marius that he is an ex-con, and Marius is not impressed by this. He actually tells him to stay away from them in future, and don't even come to the wedding that you paid for. What an ungrateful wretch. I never liked that whiny kid. Oh, my friends, don't ask me. But then Thénardier shows up to try to blackmail Valjean with the piece of material he grabbed from what he thought was the body that Valjean was carrying through the sewers. This actually makes Marius realise that Valjean is the one who saved his life. Marius was the body. He rushes to make amends with Valjean, who, of course, is on his deathbed, ready to pass away peacefully for the tearjerker ending. While Les Misérables is generally considered a more serious work of literature, it actually has a lot in common with Oliver Twist. And I mean, beyond both having successful musical adaptations that give little Cockney kids their West End debuts. Both were written by an author very popular with the general public at the time, taking on serious social issues. Both aren't afraid of funny characters with a mean streak, and both revel in melodrama in their closing acts, and have no aversion to a whole lot of coincidence. Both have so-called fallen women as their most tragic figures, which you can interpret as a demeaning extension of the male gaze from a privileged member of the patriarchy, mixed up with, the idea of woman as some kind of othered angelic being, or as an attempt to highlight the plight of a hugely underrepresented segment of society in a way that was remarkably sympathetic for the time. I'll leave that up to your interpretation. And for today, let's give it half a progressive bell. Progress! When it comes down to it, there are 3 reasons that Les Misérables is treated as a more serious work of literature than Oliver Twist. Number 1, it's written in a less satirical tone. Number 2, it's much harder for kids to get through. And number 3, there's a lot more death in it. When you think about it, that's kind of weird, because if you think of today's literature, the less you have shooting and death and people showing their super strength, the more seriously you take the work of literature. To be fair, Hugo was inspired to create Valjean based on the life of Eugène François Vidocq, who was also a criminal who ended up highly respected, and even told Hugo the story of lifting a cart to save somebody's life. So that part maybe isn't as far-fetched as it seems, and Hugo is a great fan of using stories from real life. I should talk a little bit about Hugo himself. Victor Hugo was born in 1802, the son of a general who had served under Napoleon. Like many military kids, the young Victor Hugo grew up moving from place to place, until his mother decided that enough was enough and went to settle in Paris with her 3 sons, of whom Victor was the youngest. He married his childhood sweetheart at 20, the same year that he published his first volume of poems, which was a big hit. He was a great exponent of French Romanticism, and it's actually probably a surprise to a lot of French people that while this novel and The Hunchback of Notre Dame are very famous around the world, his poems are not. Much of his most celebrated poetry is deadly serious and deals with themes like loss. Get that out of here. He wrote plays too, and it's kind of fun for an English person like me to remember that his first play, which was never performed in his lifetime because it was so overblown, was actually about the exotic land of England and their big revolution. It was called Cromwell. It was an attempt to evoke the spirit of Shakespeare, and its preface is actually quite a manifesto for French Romanticism. In fact, he probably never intended the play to be performed, just to be read like a poem. Les Misérables is a huge book, and it took Hugo over a decade to write it. I admittedly haven't read that much of Hugo's greater body of work, but I feel like he wanted this to be his masterpiece. And it was a great success upon release, even if it did not impress the French literati. Despite admiring Hugo, Flaubert said, "I found in this book neither truth nor greatness." And he even said that no contemporary of Balzac or Dickens should paint such a false portrait of society. Alexandre Dumas said reading this book was like wading through mud. And I have to admit, it is very dense, and if this book were published today, there's no way it would get released in this state without huge editorial cuts. But I've never yet found another story that affects me in such a direct and sincere way. Valjean is a constant reminder of how somebody's past can affect them, but at the same time, he illustrates how your mistakes can be overcome. And for a story about misery, Hugo talks a lot about love. The supreme happiness of life, la suprême bonheur de la vie, is the conviction that we are loved. Sure, there are other books that I admire more, like Pale Fire by Vladimir Nabokov. And there are books that I've enjoyed more consistently, beginning to end. Too many to name. But somehow there's a directness to this story, and there's a sheer self-belief in the authorial voice that somehow breaks down the skeptical barriers in me. That's why I love this book more than any others, and that's why I think it deserves to be called a great work. Alright, that's it for today. We are still in the world of literature, even if we have departed from works originally written in English. If you love the musical, or even if you don't, or indeed if you have no knowledge of the story whatsoever, I urge you to check it out. If you've got any questions you want me to answer next time, please do send them to me. My email address is in the description. Please do all the usual YouTube stuff, and I will see you again for another great work!